Assalamu alaikum and welcome back, this time to part 3 of report planning and survey design. This time we'll be looking at questionnaire design in a little bit more detail. Now, what are the things that we need to consider when we want to write good survey questions for our questionnaire? So we'll be looking at these things. First of all, question structure, wording of individual questions, criteria for assessing questions, the layout of the questionnaire, and finally a little bit more about pilot testing, which we touched upon briefly in the last lecture. Now, question structure can be divided into 3 main types. One is the open-ended question, next is the closed-ended question with ordered response categories, and thirdly is the closed-ended question with unordered response categories. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. Now, open-ended questions is where you do not provide the respondent with choices of answers, usually used in exploratory research when researchers want to find out a little bit more about a relatively unknown topic, for example. The disadvantage of open-ended questions, though, is that there's an inability to get adequate answers for a lot of the time, and so it's quite time-consuming when you want to analyze your data or your results. For example, consider this question: what was your reason for screening? And then the respondent gets a short dash to put their answer in. So this is a somewhat difficult question to answer because there's no interviewer to probe, such as, could you provide me with a little bit more detail so I'm sure I understand what you mean? And so people don't necessarily have a ready-made answer for such a question, and their answers are likely to be prone to considerable unintentional error. So this format of a question may be improved by perhaps providing more space to answer, for example, maybe 2 or 3 more lines, to visually suggest that a longer answer is desired. So a fundamental problem of open-ended questions is that the answer depends upon the extent to which respondents are willing to think hard about the questions and then write a complete answer. Sometimes it's better to list possible reasons and turn the question to closed-ended. Another solution is to break the question into multiple parts. So these are some more examples of open-ended questions. Now, the first question may produce unacceptable vague answers. For example, a nurse who might actually be someone with a college degree but working as a part-time nurse, or a night nurse, or someone trained as a personal carer. So the answer isn't as accurate or precise as you would like. So if you were to break this question down into additional parts, that might give you a better idea of what the respondent or what the respondent's work is like. Now, closed questions are also called forced choice format, and they're relatively easy and quick to fill in. They minimize discrimination against those who are less literate or less articulate. They're also easy to code, analyze, record, easy to report. However, there's still a disadvantage. They can create false opinions due to not providing enough alternatives or choices. So closed questions, in terms of the ordered response categories, one example is Likert scales, as seen in this example here. FOBT is an effective test for a population-based CRC screening program, and then the choices provided range from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So when designing these types of questions, one decision that you have to make is how many choices should you offer? And secondly, you need to decide whether to label each choice, and if so, what do you label them as? Now, another example of closed questions in terms of the ordered response category are differential scales, as you can see in this example here. How would you rate the presentation? And then the researcher provides a scale from 1 to 10, ranging from extremely interesting to extremely dull. Or it may also be in the form of a diagram, as seen in the lower example. The disadvantage of doing this, it removes a sense of meaning which you would get from a label, and it reduces it to a point on a scale. So this would be somewhat difficult or relatively difficult to analyze if you were to report this in your discussion. There is a considerable list of scalar concepts that might be used to evaluate a concept or idea within the answers for closed questions in terms of ordered response categories. So you could have strongly agree to strongly disagree, favorable to unfavorable, excellent to poor, extremely satisfied to dissatisfied, and so on and so forth. Now, with unordered response categories, this refers basically to multiple choice questions where you provide the respondents with a choice of categories. Typically, closed-ended questions with these types of categories are more difficult for respondents to answer because sometimes the amount of information that must be processed and the decisions that need to be made are more extensive than if you were to give them answers on a scale. A possible problem with this question, for example, is trying to provide detailed information on alternatives. However, this increases the likelihood of some small detail being overlooked. Here's another example of unordered response categories for closed questions. It could be in the form of a checklist. For instance, what qualities are important in a supervisor? Circle as many options that apply. Or in the form of ranking. So in the first case, respondents begin checking answers and go down the list until they feel they have provided a satisfactory answer. Now, although certain respondents will read and consider each answer, there will be those who won't. As respondents proceed down the list, they may feel that enough has been done, thus the items listed first are more likely to be checked. Now, ranking is an alternative to checklists. And this type of question requires comparing 6 options, then 5, then 4, and so forth. So this may be a better alternative. However, if all options need to be presented, then the question might be simplified by asking for a ranking of only the top 3. Limiting the choices to the first 4 alternatives means that some people will not be able to give the answer they want to provide. Trying to list all of the alternatives means a large list with a huge array of minor options. You could add another option, however, it's likely that fewer people will mention other choices if they're not listed. The open-ended responses can be analyzed separately to see which other activity is mentioned most often. Now, the difficulty comes when one tries to make statements such as respondents to this survey were 10 times as likely to say walking as their favorite physical activity as they are to say bowling. Such statements can't be defended because the stimulus of a bowling category was not offered to respondents. Another possible revision may be to change the wording of the question in a way that limits its scope only to the offered categories, as in the second example here. In this case, the absence of the other category does not force people to give an answer which they think will be misinterpreted with respect to their favorite physical activity. Now, people who write questionnaires are far more likely to overestimate the knowledge and vocabulary of respondents. When we work in a particular area, such as public health, for instance, we become used to technical terms, but we need to remember that these terms are not necessarily commonplace to the people we survey. So we need to keep the language simple, avoid jargon, technical terms, use simple words, but don't sound condescending. And finally, use simple writing guides or a thesaurus. Also, can the question be shortened? Because this would help reduce confusion and ambiguity. Now, a problem question is in this example here. Has it happened to you that over a long period of time, when you neither practice abstinence nor use birth control, you did not conceive? So what's wrong with this question? Next is something that's very important. Is the question double-barreled? Does it only ask for one piece of information at a time? Now consider this question. Do you think Bruneians should eat less and exercise more? It sounds innocent, but it actually has two questions. So an alternative would be to split them into two separate questions. So do you think Bruneians should eat less? Question 1. And then 2. Do you think Bruneians should exercise more? Another thing to ask yourself is whether the question is leading. The respondent should feel free to give an answer without feeling they're giving a wrong answer or an answer that you or someone would disapprove of. For instance, do you agree with the majority of people that health service is failing? So as innocent as this question may seem, it does seem to lead the respondent into thinking that the majority of people agree with this statement. So to avoid that kind of thinking, try and rephrase your question into either of these. Do you agree or disagree that health service is failing? Or do you believe that health service is passing or failing? Next, does the question use negatives? For instance, questions using not can be difficult to understand, especially when asking respondents if they agree or disagree. For example, marijuana should not be decriminalized. Agree, disagree. Instead, it would be better to remove the not and say marijuana should be legalized or marijuana should remain illegal. Next, is the respondent likely to have the necessary knowledge? If you were given this question, do you agree with the Gut Foundation's guidelines for bowel cancer screening? Would it be easy to answer? No, because it assumes the respondent is aware of these guidelines, when most likely they aren't. You should then provide a filter question to see if the respondent is aware of these guidelines, and then ask the question. Next, is the frame of reference for the question sufficiently clear? For instance, how often do you visit your GP? What do you mean by how often? You need to tell them what the time frame is. Is it within the last year, the last month? So you should maybe provide alternatives, for example, weekly through to never. Is the question unnecessarily detailed or objectionable? For instance, precise age or income can create problems if you ask for it. And so if you don't need precise information on these issues, provide categories instead. Another thing to consider is whether the question actually requires an answer. In this case, you may use words such as if and when, but these might invite a non-response, or in other words, invite respondents not to even answer the question. For example, now a person who did not exercise last week could not answer the first question. And also a respondent who never exercises could not answer the second one either. So given that not all respondents are required to provide an answer to these questions, we cannot distinguish what is a non-response from those to whom the question does not apply. Another thing to consider is to what extent do survey recipients already have an accurate ready-made answer for the question. Now, virtually everyone knows their age. People are frequently asked how old they are, and age is a number people are expected to know. And people are also able to report age accurately in response to many ways of asking the question. Assuming a willingness to answer age does not make a lot of difference how the question gets asked, for example, date of birth and so on. Now, for example, for this statement, cancer screening tests save lives. Do you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree with the statement? When people are asked a broad opinion question, they must comprehend the question and answer choices and think about what each of them means. They need to recall information about the topic, make a judgment about the information they retrieve from memory, and then report a response. Now in this example, most people will not have a ready-made answer that they can report. Some might even wonder what's the difference between somewhat and strongly. And to answer, respondents will need to give a definition to screening tests as the response choices. Some may try to recall all the cancer tests they've ever heard of, all the people they know who have experienced testing, and so on. Others may think only of their last screening test and its outcome. Still others may not think of any specific examples. So we need to understand the extent to which respondents will have a ready-made answer, or whether creating an answer requires considerable processing. With these types of questions, we may need to spend a lot of time drafting and testing alternative wordings of questions, and even then we can obtain only an approximate answer. So another thing to consider, can people accurately recall and report past behaviors? So try and keep recall simple and related to recent events. For example, how many minutes did you exercise in the first week of June? Versus how many weeks per week do you usually exercise? Or how many minutes have you spent exercising the last 24 hours? People usually cannot recall something precise from a long time ago. So using the last question in this case, for instance, the last 24 hours would have less unintentional error and so better precision in their answers. Another thing to consider is the respondent willing to reveal the requested information. So this might be relevant to possibly sensitive issues such as income, of course illegal activity, or personal health issues. The fact that respondents know an answer does not mean they're willing to provide it. People are more likely to give honest answers to self-administer than to interview questionnaires. So it's something to consider if it's something that's socially undesirable, whether respondents will be willing to address them in your survey. Next, will the respondent feel motivated to answer each question? So this is an important issue, particularly in self-administered questionnaires. Will they actually want to complete the entire survey? So you must consider how people will react to questions, keep questions and procedures simple, and maybe consider incentives, follow-up reminders, and especially a respondent-friendly questionnaire design. Next, is the respondent's understanding of the response categories that you provide likely to be influenced by more than words? Words are only part of the question stimulus. It also includes the choices or answers that you provide. For example, in this case, in this question, students were asked how many hours do they study a day. In this mail survey of university students, participants were asked this same question, but they were provided with different response categories. One on the left gives a low set, a low set, whereas the one on the right provides a high set of hours. As you can see, the answers which have been highlighted in blue are the ones that the respondents answered most frequently with. So the one that provided a more specific low set resulted in more precise responses, whereas the one that gave such a large range and possibly an unrealistic one only gave the researchers one possible response for all of the respondents. So clearly the answers to this question were influenced by more than words that were used to describe the response category. The responses themselves also influence the answers that the respondents will provide. So next, moving on to questionnaire layout. When it comes to instructions, you have to be very clear. The general instructions includes the introduction to the purpose of the questionnaire, assurance of confidentiality, how a respondent was chosen, perhaps, and how and when to return the questionnaire. Section introductions provide a brief introduction to each subsection. For example, finally, would like to know a little bit about your background, etc. And question instructions are very important. Indicate how many responses the respondent can tick, for example, but basically give very clear guidelines on how respondents are to answer your questions. Now, in terms of questionnaire layout, make sure you use the space effectively. Avoid clutter. Print questions on one side of the page only because it's easy to miss questions printed on the back. Also provide an area for respondents to write additional comments. Leave sufficient space for open-ended questions. And of course, is the font legible and appropriate for the age group? Now, the order of questions is something that's important as well. Make sure the flow of question order is logical. Try and build rapport, meaning make it easier for the respondent in the beginning so that they're more motivated to answer the rest of the questions as it perhaps becomes more difficult. Start with questions the respondent will enjoy answering, which are salient, easily answered, factual, etc. Then go from easy to more difficult questions, from the more concrete to the abstract, least sensitive to sensitive. Keep open-ended to a minimum, and if possible, towards the end, put your questions into sections, use filter questions, and then introduce a variety of question formats to create interest, but don't go overboard. Don't use a separate question format for every single question. That would be just unnecessary and complicated. Okay, some more things to consider with answering procedures are the questions numbered on the left, a basic thing. Is the question and answer relating to a single item on the same page? Justify your typing. And then for Likert style questions, it may be helpful to use a matrix presentation instead. So in general, short and simple means higher response rates, but also consider how you are administering your survey, the nature of your sample, and of course your topic under investigation. So you should probably know by now whether you want to administer your survey by mail, by telephone, or the web, or maybe you prefer to use personal interviews, etc. A little bit about pilot testing, the things that you should consider when you're pilot testing your questionnaire. Variation. This means if people give similar answers to a question, it will be of little use in later analysis. So avoid extreme questions. For example, assassination is acceptable in order to bring about political change. With meaning, check to ensure respondents understand the intended meaning of the question and that you understand the respondent's answer. For example, with which ethnic group do you identify? Some respondents might misinterpret and say that all groups. They may interpret the question as which ethnic groups would you like to get along with, for example. Redundancy. If two questions measure virtually the same thing, only one is needed. Scalability. If questions are designed to form a scale, ensure that they do. Non-response. The refusal of a large number of people to answer a question produces difficulties at the data analysis phase and can lead to serious reductions in sample size. So non-response may be due to the question being unclear or too intrusive, too similar to previously answered questions, and so on. So this is something that can be addressed in the pilot stage. And then an acquiescent response set. Detect this by taking questions that seem completely contradictory and see how many people agree with both. For example, an if response set might be better to be replaced with an agree or disagree format with another type of question. Also consider the flow of your question skips if necessary, timing, how long does it take to answer your questionnaire, and respondent interest as well as attention. So that's it. So to summarize what we went over today, we looked at question structure, the wording of individual questions, criteria for assessing questions, the questionnaire layout, and some issues with pilot testing. So I hope you review these in your own time. So that's it. I'll see you next time.